Yep, back again. Just testing. Testing. Been... excuse me. Just trying to embed the YouTube and Twitch players into Cat's Bits. And whilst Twitch uses the channel name, which is Cat's Bits, YouTube doesn't. It uses a specific or a unique ID that's associated with the channel. And you have to go and find that. It's not in an obvious place. So I'm just testing that, and it seems to be working. And Liana's popped up in chat, and I think I'm being stalked. But might as well use the occasion to continue with this thing. Jig. So I'm going to add some wing nuts to this. Some simple shapes. Oh, excuse me. So, extrude. 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 That'll do. So, okay, so wingnut shape. Do a split across there. Whoops, a daisy. Doesn't have to be exact. So what we're doing is just creating the approximation of a wingnut. Shrink that in the Z. Whoops. That's a bit big. That's about right. Doesn't need to be complicated or sophisticated, as long as it looks approximately like a wingnut. Well, Liana, it's better than watching TV. Grumble, grumble, grumble. Whoops. Oh, I've only selected. Here we go. Oh, no TV, so yeah. So we're going to duplicate this. Duplicate. So we're doing a control left click, so we get a loop select. Then just detach this, so that's the P key, P for Peter. And then what we can do is use this end face, snap the cursor to that, reset the pivot point to that location. And what that does now is that we've now got this. We can now use that as a pivot point. And what this does is it allows us to just rotate that. Still looks a little big, maybe. I don't know. So duplicate. Then we're going to mirror. So changing the pivot point, that's using this shortcut key is full stop, period, and comma. So with that selected, we can then just flip it over to the other side, mirror. So that's Control M, y-axis. But what we can now do is rotate this one. So switch back to the active object pivot point. And then we can set a different angle for that one. That's probably a bit too much. That's not too bad. We need to duplicate this because that's out and it's inverted as well. So flip faces. In fact, actually, we can probably shrink that down a little bit. Make it a little longer. Duplicate, Shift D. Period. Or again. So we use the 3D cursor as the pivot point. Then Control M and Y on the Y-axis. Left click to set. And that's inverted it again because we've mirrored it. So what we need to do is, well, we don't need to do, an easy way to check that something's inverted when you mirror it, just disable backface culling or enable backface culling, because without it, it's difficult to tell which way the faces are oriented without enabling displaying of normals. Which in IMVU world is, they're still quite tiny because of the size of IMVU. Pulse. No, you can. Oh yes, of course you can't. Liana was trying to post the link to the stream in Pulse, which is IMVU's messaging thing, and it won't let you do it because it's an external link, and they don't like that. So just disable that. Re-enable backface culling so we can see the face orientation and flip it. What we might want to do with this is rotate that. Whoops. We want the pivot set back to selected, and we rotate so that it matches up approximately the wing nut. join everything together. Ooh. Yes, so that's flipped that wing nut inside out because we mirrored that. So because some of these faces are right side out and some of them are wrong side out, they're inverted, we can select everything and use recalculate. And what this does is it looks at the mesh and tries to determine which way the faces should be facing. As most of them are pointing in a particular direction, this should reorient these inverted faces so that they match everything else. So if we click recalculate, it reinverts them. Excellent. And as we, because those were, let's get rid of, let's do a little bit of optimizing. Right click, press the G key twice, and we can get edge slide. Move it all the way up. We need to do this on both sides. Or you can delete or dissolve the selected edge, but you'll still have to do a little bit of tidying up. So we want to now get rid of the duplicate vertices that we've got. So those are the vertices for that particular edge. And they've been shoved up to the vertices for the underlying edge. Whoops. We need to weld this together. So select everything and then rem doubles. And that's removed 8 vertices. So if we now select these two, it now moves that entire section. And of course, because the object that when we join these together, because this object already has a material assigned, let's change the color. It auto assigns the material to the selected, or the bits that we join. But now we can do some, no, we'll leave the UV mapping for now. Let's do a little bit more to the mirror. So we want to add a minor decoration at the top. So, best way to do this. Okay, let's duplicate that face. So that's Shift D. So that creates a separate face. Right click to reset. And we want to resize it. So that's S and Y. And then what we can do is just, whoops, move it up slightly. Extrude. The E key, E for Edward. Then add some loop cuts. 1, 2, 3. And then we can just do something. Whoops, I wanted to do both sides at the same time. So switch to vertex select, loop select, and then using box select. So all we're doing here is just making a bit of decor that sits on top of the mirror. We need to remove this bottom face, or bottom set of faces, so select them and delete, X key. Ooh, and speaking of the X key, here's a tip for you, or not so much a tip. You can use the delete key. It does exactly the same thing. The alternative is using the X key. And people wonder why Blender has delete associated with the X key. And it's because as you're sat in your seat, depending on whether you're left or right-handed, if you're right-handed, you generally use your left hand on the keyboard whilst you have your right hand on the mouse. So to use delete, it means that you're stretching across your body to press the delete key. Now, if you do that once or twice, it's not so much of an issue. But if you're doing something that requires you to have your finger on the delete key, it means you're well, not permanently, but you are stretched across your body for a prolonged period, and you won't notice that you've done that until you wake up in the morning and the back of your shoulders will be aching because of that, because of holding that particular position. So this is why the delete key is also associated with the X, so that it avoids you having to constantly stretch across to reach the delete key. Obviously that depends where your keyboard is, but that's why. It's to prevent you from doing your shoulders in. To narrow this, so that's S and X. And then what we might even do is vertex select and just create a bit more three-dimensional scene, as we've actually got a shape that we can use. So the smoothing, the mesh smoothing's gone a bit wonky there, so what we need to do is split that edge, those faces, so that's Control T, it triangulates, and then we can do a couple of things. We can either leave that shape as is, or what we could do is, whoops, add a sharp edge, so that's Control E, make sharp, and that creates a diamond. So what you could do is, when you were texturing this, you could create you could place a shield or an emblem texture in this area, and then some fancy design on the side of it, and you won't get any smoothing issues. Or, depending on what you wanted on this front face, you can flip the orientation there. So that's Control E and rotate edge. So what you end up doing is creating a flat face across the front, but you essentially create a sort of a hood or an overhang, but it just applies to that face specifically. But that might mean that you would need to then clear out any, say, sharp So it creates a different look to this section. And that's just by simply changing the orientation. It's actually this edge. Changing the orientation of the edge, which then changes the orientation of the faces. What you might also want to do is actually physically mark your seams. Mark sharp rather, because the angle it breaks the edge that we've got set. So it's on 30. So if we do 60. Yeah, that's all right. It's changed the smoothing, so the illumination shading runs across this edge or this corner. Let me just turn on wireframe. It runs across this corner without breaking, so that we don't get a hard edge there. Might make that slightly larger. Yep. So that's using the same material and the same texture. So a simple way to UV unwrap this would be to split the back from the front. And then we want to mark. Oh, we have to do, oh no, that's okay. Mark the corners. So we mark a seam. That's Control E. Mark seam. And what this will do, oh, and we'd have to do it for this as well. And split that across the top there. So select everything, switch to UV editing mode, and just press the E key, see what it does. Let's just isolate that for now. So the UV map has split at the corners, and this helps us lay out a flat UV. For regular shapes like this, it helps to flatten the map, otherwise it distorts it. So if I clear these two from the top, clear those, and then redo the map, it'll distort the top. And even though this is just a relatively simple shape, if all of them were, all the corners were clear of the seam, clear seam, you're not necessarily always going to get a neat unwrapping like this. But what that does is it tends to distort, as you can see at the top here, it tends to distort the texture. So this is why you want to try and, well, if this were if there were a patterned, or if there were a wood grain texture, let's say for the sake of argument, it'll distort around the corners. So it's always just a good idea just to mark the corners and then unwrap, mark a seam and then unwrap. And what that does is it treats the front of the object as a unified UV map and the back as something separate. And because the back is an incidental detail, we can actually resize this UV and put it in a space that's not going to be occupied by another element of the object. But that's just the mirror section. Exit, switch back to default mode. Use the rest of the stand. So this is a bit of a tricky shape, so we need to do a little bit of cleanup because there are a couple of faces that we need to remove before we unwrap, because these are not used, these are hidden. So get rid of those. And position them, whoops, closer to the upper part of the mesh, because we can use vertex painting on these. And that'll add some shading. So let's unwrap. So what we need to do with this is, on the back side, select the two back inner edges and then split the split it, so you lay the seams out so that this unwraps as a tab, essentially a tab that's either attached to the front face, so if this were a wood texture, the wood grain continues over the top and round to the back, or the side, so the grain follows up. Either or. But the purpose of selecting the edge that's running down the back is that because this is generally going to be seen from this side, it means that you can hide, or at least obfuscate, the seam where the UV breaks. So we've marked the seam. Do a similar thing to the wing nuts. So we need to check that we can... no, we need that face. We need those. Okay, so we do a similar thing to that. Split it, whoops, split it down the back. Same with the wing nut. toggling between wireframe and solid mode to make selection easier. So we want to keep that. So we want to keep the... Might have to do a bit of fiddling with this. Because you've got to be careful that we don't... We want to try and unwrap. Probably do this a little bit later, but we want to try and unwrap the wing nut so that it lays out flat. So if we put a seam down here, it won't do that. Not a seam, yeah, seam, UV seam. So let's try that and see what it does. E key. Yeah, so that's the shape that we've got. And it's kind of there. So this is where UV unwrapping is a question of trial and error. There's a face we need to delete. That one. Oops, that's the wrong one. Want to delete the... Or did we already delete it? No, we didn't. So delete that. So, let's try this. Right, so mark seam, clear that one at the top. Mark that might work. So select, and just do this on its own. Oh, we've got scale values. Scale values, Control A. Now do it. So there we go. Still a little distorted. But it's getting there. So what that essentially does is it splits the right, so we've got a split there, split across the top. So what does that do? So if I select, unwrap that. See, that unwraps, so it's this section that's not unwrapping because of its position and location. So what is that doing? So if I unwrap separately, okay, so it's unwrapping. So it might be a question of having to unwrap this as just a separate smaller element of the wing nut, or doing it in a way that so you mark the seams on the edges but clear the seam, oops, not there, yeah, so clear those. Select, and then unwrap. Where are the other faces gone? Yeah, so that's better. Do a little bit of fiddling just to adjust those, but it's a relatively minor detail, so you're not going to really see anything there. But that's unwrapped that relatively flat. So that's what you want to try and do when you're doing your UVs, is try and keep everything in a single UV section or UV island. Because if you break things up, it usually means that, so if we had created that as a separate UV section, it might have meant that you end up with several UV sections, which we want to try and avoid. So we've got two faces down here that belong in there somewhere. And there we go. So it would then just be a question of just manually editing the UVs just to make some minor adjustments to get the texture density increased slightly. But that's a tiny detail that you're not really going to see, particularly if this entire object is going to fit within the realms of a 512 by 512. So all we need to do now is just essentially do the same thing on the other side. So that's, oh no, hang on, we haven't done the, so let's do the bottom. So we want to put a seam on the bottom of the foot. Again on the inside to try and hide the seam as much as possible. So select those. Unwrap, and that's what we get from just doing that. In fact, what you could do, mark seams on those so that mark seam, select, And what that's done is it's corrected the alignment issue that was happening on these end faces, because they were joined to these vertices. It distorts the texture. I'll just do this one side. So with that done, that's one side. What we can now do is add some shading with vertex colors. So switch back to default, change mode, vertex paint. Whilst you've got vertex paint active, if you press the Z key, you'll switch to non-texture view so that you can see the vertex colors. And then darken that a bit more. Now, Leanna's just commenting, there are the vertex colors that's available in, it's not vertex colors, what it is enabling vertex colors to be displayed on the mesh. So you're not actually doing anything to the mesh. But what this does is, exit that, it shades the texture, so you can assign a single texture across a lot of, so this entire object might be textured with this individual texture, just a 512 by 512, and in order to get the shading, normally you would have to paint, let me switch, you'd have to paint the areas that you want darker, but this is a cheap, quick way of negating doing that, so you don't need to do that when you use vertex colors. But within IMVU, once this is imported into IMVU, you can disable this, but it basically means that the object's going to appear essentially flat lit. So this shades the objects. You want to pay attention to the colouring, so we can go a little darker there, just to match, no, just to make it slightly darker than the ambient or the surrounding grey colour that we've created from painting the 2 points at the top and 2 points at the bottom. And that's all you do, just go around the mesh and vertex paint. It's useful, it's useful to do, useful to use, because it's a cheap way of shading a mesh and adding depth without needing to use a lot of texture assets. Yeah, as Liana's in chat, the vertex colors in IMVU just enables the display of them. Has nothing to do with what we're doing here. It just disables them or enables them so that they can be seen. So save the file. Uh-oh, 13. And we shall call it quits for this session. So that's a very straightforward mirror object. Well, furniture item, which within the rest of the room, don't know if that's how visible that is because of the huge amount of checker, but that's the mirror. So you've got a mirror standing next to a tailor's dummy, and then these seats with eventually other items on these cabinet things. A gentleman's tailor. Right, so we should call it quits. The embedded streams worked, which is what I was testing out originally anyway, which is good. So until the next stream. Well, the next stream will be for there'll be one on Twitch on Thursday. This Thursday, which is the 20... Well, that's today actually. 25th of January. Have to wait for the stream to catch up before cancelling, ending the stream. But yeah, so we'll call it quits there.